So for today's presentation, we thought we could help you understand why we are embracing so much Philip's work and how we are using it to translate between engineering at Indiana University and the arts and humanities at Indiana University in a very concrete way via Amatria, but then also trying to find ways that we can scale up engineering education and other computing and information science and information library science training, so that not only students at IU, but students around the globe benefit, ideally for free, and in a very, very hands-on way. Some of you might be familiar with our effort to bring maps of science and technology to public spaces. In fact, I would love to see how many of you have seen a map of science where the continents are mathematics and engineering and biology. How many of you have seen such a map of science? Man, we are getting there, so it's maybe a quarter of you. When we started this process, nobody had ever seen such a map because they're very expensive to produce. And so they were produced by those which had the money and the resources for those which had the money and the resources. And they oftentimes did not make it into any other public place. So 15 years it takes to get it to some, to have them embrace this new way of charting what we collectively know. Now, the initial 10 years, we had a submission process every single year. We picked the best 10 maps and we rendered them from something that was meant for a journal publication to something that could be understood in a library or science museum setting. And actually, libraries and science museums and other museums are a fabulous infrastructure for bringing a lot of science to many people, especially to those which are out of the normal schooling process. So they have done their high school, they have done their undergrad and graduate and other degrees, and now they have 70, 80 more years to live, good years to live. There might be some which are not so great at the end, but we have some solutions for that as well. So how do you keep those up to date which have left the school system? What kind of informal engagement opportunities can you provide for them, given that science and technology is rapidly advancing? We are working very closely with the Boeing Corporation, and they argue that every 2 years, half of the expertise and knowledge of their engineers is becoming obsolete, is not needed anymore, needs to be replaced by new expertise and knowledge on technologies, on methods, on data that now is available. How do you train so many engineers to keep up to date while they are working their normal work hours? It's a non-trivial challenge, and with AI moving in and many jobs becoming obsolete for human beings, you have to also retrain and upskill a lot of people, or it will be very sad for them to live on. So the first 10 years brought a lot of static maps of science and technology to many places. In the second decade, we had interactive data visualizations, and those interactive data visualizations help you understand Twitter data, help you understand news data around the globe, help you understand collaboration networks around the globe, help you understand commuter travel patterns. And given that this is not my laptop, I will not be able to demo this to you, but we could demo during the break. I would be very happy to do this. Now, the third decade, what will that decade bring? What do you do after static maps, which are very, very easy to understand for many? Interactive data visualizations, I think, are also more possible today than 10 years ago. But what would it be in the third decade? How do you communicate this enormous progress in science and technology to general audiences, my kids, my mom? How do you do this? There's so much which is new. And I believe it will be experiences, just like you have Imagineers in the Disney worlds, just like you have game developed which are for educational purposes, edutainment. You will also have more and more data visualizations in your normal environment, be it in self-driving cars or be it in the user interfaces you are using. But ultimately, some of those experiences, like for instance, Philip's creations, some of them are rather big. So how do you bring these kind of experiences and associated data visualizations to many. And this is where our deep interest in kit design comes in. So these kind of elements, which you see here, which can be built for about $40, are more affordable than some of the other creations that Philip has done. And you can, not this one, but maybe in the future, you could have multiple of those, and you could have them interact with each other. You could have them interact not only with each other, but also with groups of human beings. And so people and artifacts could work together, live together, learn together. And right now, Amatria in our environment is already living and learning with us. But we need to spread the word and the genes and the memes to get them to other places as well. Now, some of you might have worked with IoT kits. How many of you have had a robotics kit and you built it? Let's see, all the makers and builders. All right, so maybe 1/4 of the audience. How many of you have worked with wearables, which you can actually wear later on? Okay, a little bit fewer. What about smart environments? Maybe in between those two. Ideally, there would be a kit which would allow you to have scaffolds which facilitate all three of these, so from robots to smart environments to wearables, but would also help you to interlink those to each other. And actually, these different environments have very different affordances. We ran a summer camp 3 years ago at Indiana University, and the middle school kids back then, they very quickly figured out what they would do with robots and what they do with smart environments and what they do with wearables, and how these things would interconnect to each other for what kind of purposes. But going forward, it's also interesting to understand then how to debug these systems, how to optimize them for all kinds of different types of usages. And I think that's where also data visualization can play a major role. And 3.5 years ago, when Philip and I met, we started talking about how we could take the data feeds that are coming out of his creations to get us all a better understanding of how these structures really work, kind of lifting the veil and looking behind how they are made. And not every artist would let you do this. But also help engineers which are working on the electronics for these installations to optimize behavior and ultimately also optimize energy levels and signaling. Now, what you will see in Andreas's presentation is what concretely we have done in this line of research at IU. And it will have a lot of videos and a lot of images of these environments. But I also wanted to help you understand that there is general knowledge to be taken away from engaging not only with static data and rendering it in new ways, but also engaging in interactive dynamic visualizations and ultimately engaging with experience design, really designed also for social interaction. And I thought it would be valuable to introduce you to the theory behind all of that. Because ultimately, in our university settings, it's also about abstracting away from the real-world examples and generating knowledge that potentially will last you a lifetime, whereas typically software won't last you a lifetime. Maybe it lasts 5 years, maybe 10 years. But oftentimes artifacts, including interactive data visualizations, after a while they just don't work anymore. So with data visualization literacy, we refer to the literacy or the ability to read, make, and explain data visualizations. And today and yesterday, I saw a lot of different examples of where you actually get data to come out of these systems, or you could measure what these systems that are evolving actually do. And in order to do so, you need literacy. You oftentimes have text. You also have access labels and legends. You need visual literacy. Many of you are amazing designers, so you have the ability to find, interpret, evaluate, use, and create images and visual media. And you also saw a few formulas, not too many, and the ability ultimately to formulate, employ, and interpret math in a variety of contexts. Ultimately, we believe that the ability to read and write text and here read and write data, is really as important as it used to be to read and write text. And I think both types of literacy are very, very relevant for a data age, where many of us have not only in our private lives, but also in our professional lives, a lot of data sets that could be used for data-driven decision-making. So in the area of data visualization, which is about 30 years old, much younger than cartography, younger than scientific visualization, there have been many attempts to provide frameworks which help anyone to render data into actionable insights. And it's trying to also deal with the fact that there are 500 plus data visualizations, which some of you might be able to name. But bringing order to those and to bring you a kind of system that helps you to systematically make sense of which data visualization to use when is non-trivial. And ultimately, however, it's used and needed to also facilitate teaching and the practice of data visualization. So the existing frameworks, they have started to organize visualizations by user insight needs, by task types, data to be visualized, data transformations, visualization techniques, different visual mapping transformations, interactivity, deployment options, and many other features. Here we focus on not only reading data visualizations, but constructing data visualizations. And ultimately, that requires that we know a lot about human perception and cognition, because we have to take that into account. There's much rich work in cartography, psychology, cognitive science, statistics, and many other domains, which have contributed to our understanding how we can render data into visualizations. It should be theoretically grounded, but also actionable. It should be useful for you personally and your students. And it should be extendable, because new interfaces become available, new data sets become available, new needs become available. And so the big question then becomes, how can you possibly create a framework that can build on all of that, but is also valuable? And so we did an extensive literature review, developed this framework over 15 years, extensively used it in teaching, got feedback from students of what can they do and what can they not do. And then came up with a framework which basically has a typology, which you see on the left, and it has the process of making a visualization. And on purpose, it's meant to be very simple, just 1, 2, 3, read data, analyze, visualize data. For the visualization, you pick a reference system, you overlay data, you encode additional data variables. And so by making it purposefully simple, by abstracting away all the complexities, we hope that anyone soon will be able to render data purposefully into insights. Now, in terms of the typologies, there are 7 of those. And they actually overlay over the framework itself. So both together, the terminology and the process itself are needed to do it right. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to browse through some of these slides. We actually have implemented software that goes with that framework so that we can use it in teaching to help people see the data themselves on the left, see the data visualization on the right, and then they have a way to map data columns to data variables, graphic variables in the data visualization. If you look at this table, you might realize insight needs. Yeah, I have those, but maybe there are some others which you also have, and that would be a need to expand. But maybe these cover about 95% what you typically are interested in. At different data scales, there are different analysis types, different visualization types. And note here that there is no general agreement between the visualization experts of what kind of visualization types exist and how to name them. This is all in a process similar to the very beginnings of the periodic table of elements, when there were many, many different proposals of how to do this best, how to organize all these different materials. And then you have also graphic symbols and graphic variables, which help you understand what kind of mappings from data variables to graphic variables are possible. And of course, at the end, you want to interact. If it's printed, you just get closer to the map. But in many times, these are interactive data visualizations. All these build on extensive research by pioneers in data visualization. And they can now be also used in the interactive online tools that we created to empower you to learn this faster. The different data scales are probably familiar to you, but in some cases there is not a perfect agreement among the experts in the information visualization world of how to really name them and how to use them perfectly. I will leave these slides here because some of you might actually like to browse through that in more detail. And we're always interested in feedback, but I think it's also potentially useful for you to then use that process to analyze your own data. There's a huge difference between qualitative and quantitative data variables. And as you see, there are different mathematical operations you can perform on those. In terms of analysis, there is not a single visualization problem that I have seen that didn't require some kind of data cleaning and some kind of data analysis. And typically, we try to answer these when, where, what, and with whom questions using temporal, geospatial, topical, and network analysis and visualization. Ultimately, the analysis types and the visualization types are going together. They form a bimodal graph of what kind of normal pairs there are. But there are many unusual pairs which might be are tried out the first time and might just work. Visualizations, I mentioned that there are many, many different types of visualizations. Again, there is no standard set of terms for those. In fact, you will oftentimes have a radar plot also known as, and then there are 20 more words for that single data visualization. In order to refer to data visualizations, you at least need to have one term for it, otherwise you cannot refer to it. You could make a drawing of it, but that might even fail. As soon as you have a good reference system, you can actually take your knowledge from one, let's say a table on the left, and you can go over to a graph which also has just lines of vertical and horizontal lines to then place a dot. You can go over to maps, which uses latitude and longitude. You can go over to networks, which as soon as you have a layout, can also be, again, referred to every single node in the network in terms of its XY position. And you can have all kinds of projections involved as well. But there is a progression from left to right and backwards. And if you have a network, you can read out the values and put it back in a table. In our world, we distinguish reference systems and data overlays. And again, you would use a visualization substrate. You would then add graphic variables and graphic symbols to encode different types of data. And as soon as you know how to do this for a scatter plot, you can also apply it and kind of do horizontal transfer to geospatial maps, to science maps, to networks. Here, in the example, you have a proportional symbol map that exists in all these four frameworks. So as soon as you have this systematicity, you can also speed up learning via scaffolding and via horizontal transfer. In terms of graphic symbols and graphic variables, you have many, many different ones. Some are quantitative, others are qualitative. Some of them are easy for human beings, others are very hard. And we know from many, many human subject studies which ones are easy and which ones are hard. You then can take those two and create a large table. Here, whenever there's a red triangle, those are the qualitative ones. So you should map your qualitative data, profession, your favorite activity, to qualitative data variables, whereas if you have quantitative data, your height, your speed, you should map it to quantitative data variables. And in fact, this is a very large table where you have not only geometric symbols, but also linguistic symbols and pictorial symbols, and all their many different variables which you can use to encode your data in new ways. And again, interactivity at the end. For each different visualization you pick, you might like to identify for yourself what it supports and what it doesn't support. We have an online course now that helps anyone understand how to render data into insights. There are also handouts over there if you're interested in paper versions. And we hope that this course, which is a 30-hour time investment on your end, really empowers many, many to takes their own personal or professional data and render it into insights. There are also books, if you prefer that. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to give it over to Andreas. And he's going to talk more about how we actually now use these data visualizations with dendrites and moths, which are Amatria's children, and we have about 70 of them now, even though Amatria's first birthday is going to be April 11th. So she's a very fertile young lady. And Andreas will have a lot of more visuals on that part of research.
Katy already told us about the theoretical research that we do back at our lab. I want to talk about several concrete projects that we did with Philips creations in mind. Now, one of the big challenges for that was that the data we usually visualize is somewhere in the cloud. It's about papers, about publications and grants. Data coming from a sculpture, from a cyber-physical system is physical. It has an origin in space. And so in order to work together and reproduce problems, we needed some kind of physical structure at IU. Now, of course, when we started working together, there was nothing like that at IU. So we needed something that could get us started. And that brings me to dendrites and moths. What you see here are architectural drawings of these two. The dendrite on the left is a full-scale small sculpture, one sensor, one actuator. The moth on the other side, which you also see down here, really does only one thing: it actuates. It does not have any sensors. The moth is much simpler. It's also much cheaper than the dendrite. And we've been working with the dendrite since 2017. In fact, we had a summer camp with high school students. And to date, I think about 70 or 80 dendrites have been produced. Mike up there would know the exact number of that. You can see a bunch of those students here experimenting with this in the summer camp. And this coincided with engineering being offered as a degree in our school. So it was a really nice way of bringing this together. And so these are the parts that you need for assembling either of those. You can also see a fully assembled dendrite on the left. And the dendrite is really a more complex device. And we actually have a little setup back at IU that consists of both of these. I want to now share with you my favorite experience with dendrites and moths. So, a little bit of background. In October 2018, we hosted a workshop at Indiana University for undergraduate women in computer science. And we built moths with them for 3 days and wrote documentation about that. At the last day, there was a big presentation with about 70 to 100 people in the audience. And so we had a setup where we had a bunch of moths sitting on a table here. And in a second, you're going to see Mike appear up here, remotely joining from upstairs, up on the 4th floor from our lab. And Mike is going to actuate a dendrite, and then the moths are going to light up. That was the first time we actually tried out something like this, and that was by far my favorite experience with this.
Here we go. Awesome. So we have Mike upstairs. So we have Mike upstairs, and he's going to set off the infrared sensor in front of the dendrite upstairs, and wirelessly it'll set off the other one.
Oh yeah.
It's the awe effect. That moment when people who had no idea what we were talking about actually saw the system in effect, and it just triggered an emotional reaction that wouldn't be possible otherwise. So this experimenting with distributed architecture really made this workshop worthwhile. Of course, dendrites and moths are really nice to have, but then in 2018, we got something even bigger. We got Amatria. Amatria is an installation made by Philips' team, and it is one of the few permanent installations that we have at IU. As you can see, it is suspended from the ceiling. It is up on the 4th floor in a building that has a very open concept. And I'm going to show you a video of that also. Here we go. This is a time lapse of Amatria being built. I think it was about 4 weeks of really intense activity up on our floor with dozens of volunteers. We're going to see a few photos in a second. And you see how we had a scaffold in a building that was really only a couple of months old. We had moved in there maybe, what was it, 2 months ago? So there was a lot of bustling and activity going on. A few more words about Luddy Hall. Luddy Hall is new. It was built in 2017. We moved in there in January 2018. And as you can see in the top in the middle, it is a very open inner concept. I'm not an architect. I can just say it's a very beautiful building. There's lots of light in there. It's very welcoming, very different from the building we were in before that. On those other pictures, you can see volunteer activities surrounding the building process of Amatria with people young and old. We had 5-year-olds up to, I don't know how old Jim is, but all ages coming in and really trying to put in, their share of the work. Now, who comes visiting Amatria? It is really also all sorts of people. On the top left, you see 3 gentlemen from Cook Medical, which is a pharmaceutical company. On the top right, it's just a ragtag group of people that came to a public tour, which we host regularly. The bottom right, that's Michael McRobbie, that's the president of Indiana University. But my favorite tour was in the middle. That's a bunch of middle school children. So we had to explain to them what sensors and actuators are. So we told them, so Amatria doesn't have eyes, so she has infrared sensors. And she doesn't have hands, so she has actuators. And that was a really interesting way of engaging with this kind of audience also. So to bring this back to data visualization research, and back to the earlier questions we asked with Philip, is how can we use data visualization to enhance the visitor's understanding of Amatria? How can we enhance a visitor's experience by harvesting all that valuable data that's floating around the network? So what we did was we started Tavola. Tavola is Italian for tablet or table. I just picked that name because I felt like it is something that would stick, something that people remember, and in fact it did, so we stayed with that name, Tavola. So step 1 for this was to identify the inside needs of all the many people that visit the sculpture. And again, it ranges from all sorts of people. So the challenge is to compress something as complicated as Amatria into something that is visually graspable and immediately understandable without any engineering knowledge. On the left, you see a view of Amatria from the top with some of the cabling. And then on the right, that's probably my favorite drawing out of the whole architectural set. That's the drawing of the electronics that actually go through Amatria. We always show these at tours, and even if people don't completely understand it, they are enticed by it nonetheless. Now, what we didn't want is something that would be for engineers. These are 2 visualizations we created independently for Adam and Rob when they worked on the sculpture. These are visualizations of IR sensors, and we wanted to stay away from something like that, something that would be intimidating and something that would also need prior explanation from every side. So we identified as our insight needs the geospatial insight into the structure of the sculpture, understanding the parts of the sculpture and where they are in space, meaning visualizing the location and type of the sensors and actuators, and allowing people to compare states of the sculpture by harvesting IR sensor values as a first step. So in terms of data acquisition, we hit quite a few roadblocks initially. This is the original 3D model straight out of Rhino. You can see the resolution is immense. And then we tried to import that into Unity, our video game engine, and we ran into huge problems with that. Like the first, I want to say 2 to 3 days of having the team, that were just me being like really, really frustrated with all of the computers in our lab. So with the great help of Timothy, we actually got a model that was much simplified, a bunch of very simple shapes that we could easily import into Unity, which also allows us to deploy Tavola to all sorts of devices. So you don't need a $2,000 rig to run Tavola. You can run it on a tablet or even on a phone. So this is the first initial version of Tavola. As you can see, this is kind of like the alpha version from the reveal. You see that we had a simplified 3D model of Amatria with the walls on the side. We have a labeling system. And then we have a data overlay. So we have a reference system, which is the sculpture, and a data overlay. You can also see that we have UI elements. We have a legend on the bottom left and a bunch of buttons on the right. And so Katy and I sat together, and we decided that if we really want people to love using an application like this, we need to have a graphic designer look over it. So Leonard, our graphic designer in our lab, took a stab at it. And I think that we did a huge improvement with that. This is also a video showing you parts of the functionality. There we go. So what you see here is the sculpture suspended in 3D space in Luddy Hall with a very colorful, bright data overlay. You can see the staircase leading up. We wanted to reduce the environment of Amatria in the model as much as we could, while still facilitating, allowing it for people to orient themselves, understanding where they are. So we added this marker here also. This is where we usually demo the application. This is also where we want to deploy it more permanently. What you can also see is you can turn parts of the data overlay on and off. Right now, all we see are the sensors, and it should help people understand that sensors really only make sense where people are. It doesn't make sense to put sensors up there in the spheres where nobody can ever reach them anymore, unless, of course, you build a scaffold. And then this kind of interactivity of turning sensors and the overlay on and off was really important for us. One of my favorite parts in the morning is to walk into Luddy Hall and look up at Amatria from the staircase. I always feel like it's smiling at me on the left side. And then on the right side, you see the rendering from within Unity, and you can see how those views really match up nicely with each other. And it's a really fascinating experience to walk by the sculpture every day, several times, and then be on your computer and pretty much explore the same space, but much more simplified. Okay, thinking about how to craft a meaningful experience. I only want to briefly touch on the data overlay. We detailed all of this in our white paper, but we really put a lot of time and effort into making a data overlay that sticks out and that really brings the point across. So you can see that we use several graphic variables on the left side, such as shape and color hue, for several graphic symbol types. So we used cubes for sensors, cubes for actuators, and spheres for sensors. Another part about the data acquisition is, mentioned earlier, there's a lot of real-time data coming out of Amatria. Adam Francie implemented that for us even before the reveal, which I think is a great accomplishment. Don't worry too much about the graphic on the left. What's really important is this line on the left that says via UDP. That is a data stream coming out of the master laptop of Amatria. That's like the brain of Amatria. And you can then receive that data stream anywhere from within that network. So on the right, it's just captured with a simple Python script. What you see here are infrared sensors. We get infrared sensor values for each sensor at 2 Hertz, so twice a second. For the next seed of Tavola, I have to explain something about the physical structure that's related to the infrared sensor data. You see here a sound sensor scout. A sound sensor scout is a distinct part of Amatria. You see 3 infrared sensors, that's those black pieces in the front. And these constantly measure the proximity of foreign objects. And we thought this is a really nice way for people to actually interact with the sculpture. That's how Amatria perceives her environment, okay? So we developed a scene, which I'm gonna show here again. What we see here is a screen recording with an overlaid video recording on the left, and these are synchronized, okay? So what you're gonna see here is, in the picture, a hand coming in towards the sensor. And then a dynamic data link to the sensor actually produces this dynamic data overlay. The closer you are to the sculpture, the redder those particles get, and also the wider the emission cone gets. And at the same time, on the bottom left, in order to make it really understandable, we created this little legend that is also dynamic, showing you the current distance you have to the infrared sensor. The idea behind this is to infuse almost some kind of emotional dimension, I think, to the data through the colors and through those particle effects. That was one of the advantages of using Unity 3D, which is actually a video game engine. You have a lot of really neat built-in native functionality, such as those particle systems. I want to also briefly describe Leonard's great work, our designer. All of these UI elements that you see on the top right, like how to rotate the camera and how to activate the sensor. All of these are custom made. So Leonard actually drew all of these in Illustrator by hand. Nothing here is stock, which I think is really impressive. In terms of deployment, you can see on the left side that is Tavola running on an actual tablet, relatively stable initially. And you can see the actual sound sensor Scout in the background. Now, I must say, with Unity, one of the great advantages of Unity is that it is relatively easy to deploy to different platforms, except for iOS. So deploying to Windows, deploying to Android is really straightforward, and it requires very little work on the developer side. What you see on the right side is a little graphical experiment that we did where we experimented with depth of field. So you can see that the focus here is on that speaker in the middle. And then the vials up on the top with the specular highlights are actually outside the depth of field. So we chose a virtual aperture for that one. Unfortunately, this ran really poorly on an Android tablet, so we're not going to explore that any longer for now. In terms of future work, and what we want to do with this is we are planning a set of user studies. We will really want to test the inside need satisfaction. We want to find out if you have two groups of people under Amatria and they both get an introduction, like by a guide, and then one group gets to use Tavola and one group doesn't, can we actually measure differences in scores if we give them a questionnaire and ask them questions about the structure of the sculpture, to really trying to quantify the impact that this application could have, not just for Amatria, but for all sorts of interconnected systems. Further, we want to validate the use of the graphic symbols and graphic variables. We want to find out, is this a legible data overlay, even for people that do not usually interact with data visualizations at all? We are further planning the deployment via a 32-inch touchscreen. I have also a little video for that. Here we go. So this is an actual 32-inch touchscreen. We recently purchased it. We're going to deploy it for Amatria's first birthday in April. Like a nice little suite of birthday things for her. And the really, really beautiful thing about a 32-inch touch display is that you can see people working together. Very initially, we explored the possibility of exploring Philips sculptures through augmented reality with a headset device. And the immediate problem with that is this is a solitary experience, and one person at a time can do it, unless you spend significant development time and a lot of money of getting people into the same shared augmented experience with different headsets. So this is a very scalable approach, and it is also an approach that really facilitates collaboration, and that's something that we want to see around Amatria. To conclude, on the bottom right, this is my favorite experience with Tavola. Katy and I went on a research trip to Germany, and then it was kind of, we had to give an impromptu talk about our research, and I wanted to demo Tavola. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Dresden, and it was 8 o'clock in the morning in Indiana, and there was actually, we actually already had colleagues in the lab that were working that early. So we asked them to go under Amatria. We opened up a real-time connection with Tavola, and then we could actually see them walk under the sculpture in the form of the data they created. And that was a really, really, really powerful experience. That it just worked, from across several continents. It was a really beautiful experience. That is it from my side. I want to thank you very much for listening, and I think we're open to questions now.
I wonder if I might offer one question. When I saw this presentation, I found myself reflecting on truth and falsehood, how we know things, the profound kind of responsibility of sharing complex visualizations. And it struck me that we may have moved from one to another form of understanding things, from perhaps transcendental knowledge, where we can take things as premises, overarching ourselves, to syllogistic knowledge, to the construction of knowledge by comparison and by synthesis, to projective knowledge, where things are asserted and things survive by fitness, but also by kind of tribal distillation and power, rendering the kind of unspeakable quality of loss of truth And I wonder if you could speak about the state that we find ourselves in our current politics, in terms of what can be offered for understanding truth and participating in data.
You go first.
I'm not going to talk about politics here, no. But I'm happy to reveal that typically data visualizations are featuring those which paid for the data visualizations most prominently. That was always the case. If you look at the old maps of the world, whoever paid for making that map, and it was a lot of money to make a map of the world, they were in the middle, they were upright, they were surrounded by gorgeous women and a lot of palm trees, and it was always this way. Now the beauty is that Philip and I, we have been submitting grant proposals, but have not been lucky to get funding together. So there's actually no problem from the financial end. But as you know, you can lie with maps, you can lie with statistics, you can lie with networks, and there are many books on that. And oftentimes it's good to understand how lies come about and how they are made, because you can then look for them in data visualizations. I think in general, if people not only see Philip's work as artwork, but if they see it as a way in for themselves to get inspired to engage with IoT, to get inspired to lift the veil and look underneath the hood, and to really understand how it works. In a simple scenario like what you have here, just one infrared sensor, and how responsive it is to your own hand, and seeing immediately how responsive it is because the feedback is immediate. I think then they potentially take on the challenge to engage with this brave new world. And it's really true that many have no formal training in IoT. Still, they will have to understand it, because otherwise we are stuck with having engineers and computer scientists invent our futures. And I don't think you want to live in those futures. I think you want futures which were collectively designed by people here in this room and many others which are not engineers and computer scientists also. And so how do you get to empower so many different types of talents and ambitions and hearts also to help us arrive at desirable futures, which we all want to live in. And I think Philip's creations are fabulous attention attractors. But then as soon as you're excited and in love with them, where do you funnel all that attention and love towards? And so I think by having these data visualizations, they can now try to explore how many sensors are there, what makes it all work, how sensitive are these sensors. So it's a very, very easy way in. And then, of course, for the engineers on the team, you want the high ceiling. You want the low floor for anyone, but then you want a high ceiling for all those which are trying to optimize these systems. And so I don't know if this in any way answers what Philip asked me to answer, but I believe there is a huge opportunity for not only spreading what LSAC has done in terms of these larger installations, but also by building smaller IoT sculptures, which are not as rough and rigid and deterministic as most of the robotics and other kits which are out there right now, but robotics kits which are fluffy and which are emotionally enticing and which are easy to build and which maybe you want to have sit on your shoulder half a day long. I think we don't have these kind of kits right now, but they would attract a totally new audience to building things that ultimately might combine with each other and us to get us environments that are livable and enjoyable.
One thought on this. Philip, of course, you are right. I think ever since humans use data, first it has been misused for propaganda, to communicate for certain needs. I think it's important for us to remember that data visualization specifically usually follows one out of two paradigms. One is communication. Think textbooks, think news media, or think business reports. It's where you have a message that you want to get across. The other paradigm is to facilitate exploration. That's what we want to do with Tavola. That's also what is really important for the sciences. Exploratory data analysis, where you have a multivariate, really hard to comprehend data set consisting of hundreds of CSV files. How do you make sense of that? It is by stepping through it with visualizations. And you're not necessarily trying to communicate anything, you try to explore. And it's interesting that museums and informal learning environments do very much the same thing. So I think this is a very good medicine against the spread of more communicative data science.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Maybe to expand upon Philip's question in terms of some explorations that he and I have been talking about using bio-based plastics in a transparent supply chain related to that, I was wondering if you could elucidate some specific trends akin to the Environmental Sustainability Index that came out of Yale, or any attempts to develop more accessible, for example, regenerative supply chain, taking the consumer of a particular good all the way back to the soils themselves. Have you all been seeing any trends in terms of data visualization that would afford the consumer, outside of the simplistic kind of fair trade branding, over to a more rich experience of realizing the impact of what we're doing in terms of consumption?
There are many fascinating data visualizations which, for instance, try to show you where all of these things in your fridge come from. So you could almost do like a supply chain management. Where did it all come from? How can you assemble it in new ways to potentially have good meals? And then hopefully you eat the entire meal, maybe even lick your plate. But at the end, you don't want much waste, because this is all good food and it's good for you. But in some cases, things might still get thrown away, and maybe they are produced in a way that they can be recycled. So there are some studies which actually attached RFID tags on all the many things that end up in a trash bin. And then they followed the trace of all of these along their long, in some cases really enormously long travel trajectories. And whenever you travel, petrol is spent, energy is wasted. So ideally, you could just convert it into compost and use it in your own local gardens. But in many cases, it actually goes crisscross across America. It's really fascinating to look at some of those data visualizations. And this has not much to do with what we just presented, but I think there are some fascinating data visualizations which do not only help you understand, but they make you feel how wrong this all is. And it's only if you get to the emotions of people that they change behavior. If they just understand, in many, many cases, they do not change behavior. I think many of us understand that we should do at least 1 hour of exercise today. How many of you think that you're going to do that today? Good for you. Good for you. But it's all of us which should be doing that, right? So how do you make time for it? How do you actually get to that point? And maybe if I ask you tomorrow, it's a totally different story, because you're not on Philip's hook anymore. but ultimately, you have to get to emotions, and that's why we are embracing partnerships with artists. So we oftentimes have visiting artists in our environment to get to exactly the part where you want to change behavior. And in order to get there, it's not just a data set and a visualization that really works. It's making the data set so tangible and making the visualization so emotionally disturbing, if I can say it this way, that you really, really deeply engage and feel that you must change your own behavior, or you must change the system in which you operate.